fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
James Dubro, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, James, let's start. Let's find out about you. How did you get into writing these books? First of all, like where did that come from?
It's a long story, but I'll do it short. I got into crime, my life in crime, in a PhD at the University of Toronto in 18th century English literature, which sounds a long way from crime, but it isn't. If you know anything about 18th century literature, we had a lot, Fielding, Jonathan Wild, the thief-taker general, a lot going on. But at any rate, I suddenly got a lectureship canceled, so I needed to get some work. And a friend of mine was a producer at the CBC, so I got a job as a researcher on a television documentary, and they asked me for subjects, and I said, having come from the United States to do my PhD, I said, well, the CIA is everywhere. Let's do a thing about the CIA. Now, this is in early 73, right? And they said, oh, well, that's pretty hard to do. And I said, nah, it should be all right. Anyway, we did a 1-hour documentary on the CIA in Canada, spent a year doing it, and it was quite a sensational program on Canadian television. We were attacked by Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister. We revealed the fact that there was a secret intelligence agency in the Canadian science establishment, and we revealed all sorts of undercover operations and murders and God knows what. That Willy Brandt had been working for the CIA, a whole bunch of things that came out of that show. We got 5 stories in the paper the next day, including 2 in the New York Times. So from that, the CBC wanted us to do a series of documentaries on organized crime. So I spent 5 years working on about 8.5 hours of documentaries on organized crime, the mafia, Asian gangs, bikers, the whole kit and caboodle. I started out by not believing that the mafia was terribly well organized or a conspiracy. I quickly changed after I read all the material and interviewed people like Bob Blakey and others who had listened to the wiretaps. And from that, the books, you asked me about the books, they came out of really all the films I did for the CBC. That we had a few high-profile godfathers killed here in Toronto in 1983. So I had to write I didn't have to, but I wrote a book about the one that we focused on, the ones we focused on in Connections. It was called the TV series. And Paul Volpe, who was a Canadian gangster who worked very closely with the mob in Philadelphia, Montreal, and Buffalo. So that book led to, and you know how these things go, that book led to another book about the mob going back into history in the 20s, about Rocco Perry, who worked with the Canadian, who worked with Al Capone in the 20s and 30s, and his most incredible 2 wives, they were these Jewish gangster wives who really ran the mobs in the 20s here in Canada and the 30s. Fascinating women. Someday there'll be a TV series about them. And then I wrote a book on a woman who was a mistress to a lot of mafia people and would be loaned out to visiting American mafiosi when they came here for an evening. It's called Mob Mistress. And then the most difficult book was the one on Asian gangs. I started working on that in the early 80s. Didn't get the book finished for over 10, 15 years. It's so complicated, the names, and trying to cover all the research in China and Hong Kong and all over the world. But there were so many international gangs and had been operating for over 100 years in some cases that were trafficking in people, human beings, drugs, and of course, most recently, in fentanyl and money laundering. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being laundered money. We'll get to that later. Right now in North America by these Chinese mobs that are directly tied in. This is the important thing. They're directly tied in with the Chinese government. It's the only way it can work in China. Only way it has ever worked in China, really. And so these triads are very closely working with the Chinese government. The Chinese government has so many levers that they can use in dealing with various countries in the world, and that's one of the most important ones. And they've really been behind the fentanyl epidemic, opioid epidemic in North America in the last 10, 15 years. And I think Trump has touched on that once or twice, but hasn't done that much about it.
He's got his hands full.
He's got his hands full. That's an understatement.
Yeah, he's busy. He's got the Bible in his hand, so he's ready.
The Bible, right.
Yeah. Did you ever worry about some sort of repercussion or some sort of like when you're dealing with mobs and the Asian underworld and the Chinese government, and you're writing about them and researching about them, and they've got to know about you. So, do you ever worry that something could happen to you, or not just physically, but?
Yeah, I've been careful, but you're right. I mean, obviously, a lot of times they did know about me, and some cases, I've had my close calls. I remember I was almost shot once in China. I went in over the border from Shenzhen, from Hong Kong to Shenzhen, with a friend of mine who was a triad. See, now this is the funny thing: the triad people get along quite well with the Chinese government people. So, anyway, he took me in. He was showing me the routes they were moving people and drugs on the Chinese side when we got surrounded by the People's Liberation Army with guns and all that. But we talked our way out of it. And there's often, amazing how many things you can talk your way out of. You see that even now in the coverage of the excesses of some police in dealing with journalists. Most journalists can talk their way out of getting too roughed up by cops in the middle of a protest. And likewise, I've had dinners with triad bosses in Hong Kong and Toronto, and actually, normally it was quite luxurious. We had fabulous food, no bill,
That's even
little
better.
presents. Yeah, little presents, they're trying to impress me because there are, like everything else, like the mafia and everything else, they're all still rival groups, right? So while we have triads, it's not one group. There's literally hundreds of triad groups, and many of them are fighting with each other. They often work together too. But so I was able to play Vietnamese gangs against the triad gangs and the Big Circle boys, which is one of the ones involved today. These are the gangsters from mainland China who came out of the prison, the People's Liberation prisons after Mao in, it would have been back in the 60s and 70s. The Big Circle boys gangs operate all over North America, Vancouver, Toronto, certainly in Singapore. Well, not Singapore as much as Hong Kong, certainly China. They're the number one people in methamphetamine, money laundering, as I say, hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, and the fentanyl trade. So the Big Circle boys have to be organized crime gang. They're not one gang, though. There are many rival groups within. This is true of all gangs. The Russian mafia, there's many Russian mobs, as I'm sure you know, many biker gangs. So none of these things are, they don't control everything in their orbit.
So that executive that got arrested, the Huawei, Wanzhou, is this something to do with Chinese gangs and underworld as well, or is this
not directly in that case? But you see, there's the thin line there. Obviously the founder of Huawei and his daughter, who was arrested. I doubt if that case is ever going to go anywhere. I mean, they really don't have that much on her. But the company like that obviously works with gangs. It's in the same way that someone like Stanley Ho, who just passed away, the gambling boss of Macau, who was multi-billionaire, he wasn't a gangster himself, but he worked very closely with the gangsters. It's part of their way they operate. You work with everyone. You work with government people. You work with gangsters. You work with legitimate people. Anything that will increase your reach and with the least amount of problems, because gangsters can cause problems, particularly if you run a casino, right? And Ho ran a casino for like 40 or 50 years. He was his family was from a line of people that ran gambling and casinos going back almost 150 years. So, there are rich Chinese business people, and Huawei is no different, that will work with criminal elements as need be. As we saw, for instance, when there was a problem in Hong Kong, big problem last year, they used elements of the triads to beat up people in democracy movement. Not Huawei, but the government. Huawei would do it very diplomatically, whatever they did, but it's not black and white in China. It's all gray.
Yeah, I have to. It's pretty. It's pretty. I don't know how do you say this. It seems to be really quiet. A lot of people don't realize that there's such an underworld existing in Canada. It's always a surprise. Like when the money laundering happened and made the news, everyone's sort of shocked, as if like that doesn't happen here.
It does.
Yeah, it does. But why do you think that is? Why are Canadians not noticing or not aware of it, or are they just denial, or what do you think?
Well, everyone was asleep at the switch, and a lot of that money that came out and still being investigated, royal commissions and this and that, came out through casinos where it was pretty hard to detect since gambling became super legal in Canada. So these tens and hundreds of millions of dollars were just flowing through all these things. And the DEA was onto it pretty early, but they kind of watched it, and then I'm not quite sure. I don't remember exactly what made it surface, but there were a few public events that made it surface. A few, I'd have to go back and look, but it seems to me there was some overt criminal activity that appeared, and they suddenly realized what was going on. There was actually a senior Mountie RCMP officer who figured it out in the money laundering department, and he took it over. I think he's still in charge of dealing with it because it's so massive. But it's not just Canada. I mean, it's through U.S. companies, and of course in the United States it would be mostly through private companies that you wouldn't have access to necessarily. So, but you're right, it was kind of a sleeper issue. In fact, so much of a sleeper issue that Asian crime generally was almost not looked at all, for the last 15 years, except for the odd killing and the odd, we had a guy ended up in cement in Toronto Harbor. He was a gambling guy. And the rivalries between the Vietnamese gangs and the odd killings and shoot-ups in Chinatown. But we didn't really have a feeling, and of course they were involved in, as marijuana became more available and grow-ops, they were running most of the grow-ops in Canada. They would bring over Vietnamese women to sort of care the plants, and they would sell the drugs in Canada into the United States. So there was a lot going on, but somehow it didn't get all put together by anyone. It hasn't been a RICO case in the United States against Asian crime in a while. There hasn't even been a big case in Canada against Asian crime, aside from the money laundering and the talk about the fentanyl. There hasn't been a big case. There have been drug cases, heroin cases, which connect to the same crime groups. There are also big circle boy gangs, mainland Chinese gangs. But it has been a sleeper issue, and part of its political correctness, for a long time, particularly in Canada, we didn't want to identify it as Chinese or Vietnamese or even Asians. You know, when I started working on this in the early 80s, it was the Chinese unit, and we had a triad operating right here in Toronto, so they could hardly deny it, right? They were extorting students, and they were doing all sorts of incredible things here in Toronto, and dealing with all the gangs in the United States. And then we had a lot of Vietnamese gangs here in Toronto, and a gang war where 10 or 15 people were killed in Chinatown in the 90s. So these things became very, very open and discussed, but then there was a reaction against that. The community, kind of like the Italian community, got together and said, no, this is anti-Asian, anti-Chinese. And so the police kept changing the names of the departments, and there was less and less focus in the media on it, and they just went undercover. And happily selling drugs, methamphetamine and marijuana and grow-ups and fentanyl and making a lot of money, and gambling. I didn't talk about gambling.
We rarely hear about it here in Vancouver anymore, which is odd.
That's
I guess
amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
That is amazing, because Vancouver was the heart of the gang wars of the 80s and 90s. Asian gang wars were just...
Yeah, I mean,
they
I
don't
was
kill
here
each other anymore.
It seemed like every other day there was a retaliation murder from one side or the other, and lately we don't hear about anything. I don't know if anything is just not going on, or maybe they've moved on to other things.
I think that some of the gangs are still there that were fighting, but the UN gang is still around. But there's so many different groups now, not just Asian, for one thing, and for the other thing, well, in Vancouver, the smart Asian gangsters have moved on. They moved on to fentanyl, where they're making lots and lots of money. You know, a lot of the things that they were shooting each other about was not really much. It was bribery money. It was small-time marijuana and methamphetamine systems, and they were having to fight with bikers and the Russian mob and the mafia too, where they cornered this whole fentanyl thing through, you know, making it legally from China, mainland China, and they also cornered a lot of the money laundering thing back in 2 years ago. So that made it a lot easier, and for some reason law enforcement didn't get onto it, as we said earlier, for a long time, which made it even much easier. And then the names are very confusing for reporters. And, you know, I'm trying to sell stories over the years about Asian gangs. People always said, no, the names are too complicated. You have too many hoes, and, you know, people can be very simplistic sometimes, you know. And trans. But the thing is, the names are actually very colorful. And, you know, this goes back, talk about colorful, you know, when the Chinese gangs were really covered was back at the turn of the 19th century, and the 20th century rather, and the wars between the hatchet men. There were incredible tong wars between 1900 and 1920s in Vancouver and San Francisco and New York, even in Toronto, where the hatchet men would, you know, go around intimidating and killing people, and they had to bring in the ambassador from China and a judge to sort it all out after many years. It was pretty sensational. You know, one Tong boss wrote his memoirs back in 1930. It was very popular. And these Tongs were very powerful groups. They were mostly groups of family groups within New York and other places, but they had criminal activities included. You know, it's rather complicated why these criminal activities came that way. It really is because when the Chinese came to North America, there was a lot of prejudice and a lot of bigotry against them. So they weren't allowed to bring their women. They weren't allowed to stay very long. They came for the railroad or the gold mines. And basically, they had to bring in their own, for the men they had working on the railroads and the gold mines, they had to bring in their own women. So they brought in prostitutes. They had to bring in their own drugs, opium, and make their own drugs. And activities, gambling. So all those things were almost, you know, made possible by the way the bigotry was. So we had all those things that developed in the early part of the 20th century in West Coast and the East Coast, certainly New York, and the subsequent Tong Wars. So it's a long cultural history to all of this. I have a lot of this in a book I wrote called Dragons of Crime, which is I just reissued on Amazon.com as an ebook. Asian Mobs in Canada. There haven't been many books on that subject at all. You know,
I wonder why.
It's amazing.
Do you think it's just because people don't feel threatened by it?
That's part of it. You're right. People don't. They feel much more threatened by the mafia, by bikers. You're right. And street gangs, obviously, certainly in Canada, and I'm sure I know in the States, street gangs are Black youths, Somali youths, Haitian youths in Montreal. They're much more threatening because they're much more visible. You know.
Yeah. Well, I think people. Well, with these gangs, the Asian gangs, they tend to focus on each other. They tend to kill each other a lot more than coming out, and you very seldom hear about someone being killed by accident or involved in this. So that has nothing to do with the gangs.
It happened in New York.
Yeah.
It happened in Seattle, I think. It certainly happened in San Francisco. You know, when they had back in the 90s, there was a mass killing at a gambling house in Seattle, I believe, and there was one in. Do you remember that?
I don't. But
well, the gambling houses were run by the Triads, and there was battles with Vietnamese gangs, and there was a lot of murder. But that's why I say back in the early 90s, mid-90s, it was much more common to see coverage of it. And the other problem is the names are so complicated. It's not like Al Capone or John Gotti, right? We're talking about Lau Wing Kui, which is pronounced differently than it's spelled, Kui. You're talking about names that people don't relate to. And that's a problem, too. So there's a lot of cultural reasons for that. And the fact that there haven't been heroes made out of any of the criminals, you know, as the same way they have with the Italian mafia, or even bikers with Sons of Anarchy, say. There haven't been the same level at all as Chinese gangsters. I mean, Eddie Chan was one, Nicky Louie in New York, but they come and go so fast that they don't get known by the public at all, and so they just pass through the system for those vaguely exotic names.
Well,
So
you would think
Sorry.
you'd be able to write something about, you know, because a lot of the stories like Al Capone and all those, there's been a lot of movies and stories presented, right? So I just wonder why they couldn't do it with some of these Asian gang leaders.
Well, they did. They did in the 20s, 30s, and they did again a little bit in the 90s, not a lot. But right now, you're right. There hasn't been much. I mean, there's one famous movie. Well, all the Chan movies, but The Year of the Dragon. You ever see that movie?
No,
that was about the Triads, and they were connected in the movie with New York. And I saw it in Toronto. When they mentioned the man in Toronto in the movie in Toronto, everyone roared, you know. But it was, you know, Hong Kong, China, New York, Toronto, San Francisco. That was The Year of the Dragon, Mickey O'Rourke. Very fine movie, very sensational. It just, for some reason, it hasn't been gone into by the sensational movies, or even the whole true crime genre, which is so popular right now, and documentaries. You see very little about Asian crime. You know, I'm working on 2 different ones right now, actually 3. 2 of them are on serial killers. For some reason, the true crime documentaries love serial killers cases.
Yeah.
And there's a company called Oxygen, do you know it?
Oh yeah. I've been on one of their shows, so.
Yeah, well, I did. Yeah, I'm about to be. I think it's on in August about that like exotic murders, and there's one that didn't even get any attention in Toronto. A gay murder. A guy had his husband murdered through a hit person anyway, who was a lover, and they're doing a full hour on it in Oxygen. Then they're doing the serial killing, of course, which I've done other things on. Macarthur, the guy who slaughtered 8 people here in Toronto in the last couple of years. Long, complicated story. The police were totally screwed it up for a long time. So they're doing that, but I don't know how sensational they are, or whether they. And the other thing they tend to do is recreate things, and I'm a little worried about that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
It's some of them.
Dramatic recreation. They tell me they're not going to, but we'll see.
Yeah, they become very fictionalized, and that dramatic recreation creates the story in people's minds, and they believe that's what's happened.
Yeah, and even the CBC, which is hardly, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is hardly a sensational American media outlet, but even they do that. Just recently, I saw a program about the police officer in the case called The Detectives. It was also about the serial killer, but they had an actor playing Hank Insignia, the cop, and it lost all credibility in my mind, having an actor speaking the words, and they had one of the victims, tied down in the bed, which also lost all credibility because it was recreated. They had an actor playing the cop, but they also had the real cop in the show, so it was very confusing from a storyline point of view, to say the least.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And that's the CBC that's doing that. That's the public broadcaster.
Well, they're all trying to get in on the popularity of it all, I guess. And
Exactly.
and when I did that show, it was the same thing. They only want the real salacious and
Right.
wild parts, and they want to keep people tuned in, I guess.
Sure. Well, that's understandable. I mean, you can do it responsibly, and particularly in the serial killing case here, the most recent one. I mean, the cops were, had gone down tunnel vision about a cannibalism ring for 2 years, and then left everything for 4 years while more people were killed. So there's lots of responsible journalism that has to be done there. So I'm hoping they're not going to avoid that, but it's hard to say. I did a show here in Toronto, and it hasn't come out yet, and they weren't focusing on the police, because I helped get the lead police investigator, but they will bring it up for sure, because it's part of the story. But until I see it, I'm just not sure, because it's such a sensational story. You've dealt with serial killers, how sensational it can be.
It's fun.
Yeah, there is that aspect, I admit. And the police are often way behind them. That's why they're successful serial killers. They get away for so long. You wouldn't be much of a serial killer if you got caught right away.
Yeah.
And that makes it real challenging for the cops.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, the whole thing. But Canadian crime, but is different than the American crime quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And even the reporting of it. So it has a different feel to it, I think.
Usually, yeah. But you should have seen the coverage a couple of years ago as the bodies were being discovered. It was over a period of a year. Once the police really got into their investigation, they were discovering bodies and planters, and it was so sensational, and yet the media here went right along with it. Overnight, we became the American media. It was incredible. They were staking out for, watching cops looking for bones in backyards and all this stuff. It was pretty bad.
They're still looking at Macarthur for murders, the murders from the village in the 70s, I believe, or the 80s.
But yes, I know about that because I did a lot of work on that during the whole period, and I was living in Toronto in the 70s. I remember those murders. We were all terrified. Some of them were murdered as after coming to one of the major bars, but believe me when I say there's very little evidence to tie him to anything in the 70s. He was married then. He didn't seem to be killing people. He didn't really start until around 2000 when he attacked a fellow in the gay village. But they are looking, and it's always possible. But 8 murders is pretty damn impressive, and there were another 4 that he almost killed, so that's 12. Actually, there's another one, 13. For any serial killer, that's a lot. And got away with it for so many years. It was only in 17 he was arrested, so he got away with it for over 15 years.
Oh, and he was eating the people he killed, or
no?
What was
That's Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah. So what was Macarthur's motive? Do you think, or what do you think he
his
was
motive
doing?
is very complex. But what he actually did was he ensnared mostly recent immigrants from Asia, from Sri Lanka, from Iraq, Iran was one of them. Anyway, from recent immigrants who were slightly vulnerable, not that much younger, but in the 20s and 30s. He was older. Now, Macarthur was 67 when he was arrested, so he was one of the oldest serial killers ever. There was a sexual motive for sure, but a lot of it was he had relationships with them before he killed them. I mean, the first murder was someone he had working for him. He ran a landscaping company, and he was working for him, and he had a sexual and social relationship with him for years before he killed him and put him in a planter, and then kept him on his Facebook page for another 10 years. He didn't have that many friends on Facebook. Cops should have been able to find that because the guy had been missing all that time. He kept things that just like most serial killers, he kept things in relation to their bodies and corpses, and he kept the bones very close. He had a place where he stored all the bones and all the bodies, and they were never found, so that was a clever technique. But in terms of why he killed them, I think it has a very complicated having to do with how he dealt with his own homosexuality and the thrill he got. He was into a bit of S&M sex, but that wasn't the cause of it either. Often, though, a lot of these people, and certainly the ones that got away, were into some hot S&M thing where he just went too far, and they realized that he might kill them, although they didn't go to the police. And of course, drugs were involved sometimes too. It was pretty... it was almost totally sexual. Why he did it. It was part of that crazy killer thing that they can be part of you, not by eating them, but by killing them. By total control. I don't know if you ever spoke to a serial killing expert like Peter Vronsky, but they can explain it better than I can. But it's fairly complicated, the motives. It's about control. It's about identity. And it's about a lot of serious psychological issues. Obviously, I saw Macarthur in court. He was a broken man. He had no control. He said nothing, absolutely nothing, even as he pled guilty to eight homicides.
Wow. Yeah, Peter and I wrote a book together. I just talked to him yesterday, so yeah.
Oh, well, you know Ron.
I know him.
Okay.
Yeah.
He's quite a character.
He's a guy.
Yeah.
I like him. Like him a lot.
Oh, he's very good. Yeah, I knew him before he got into serial killing as a specialty, but did I say serial killing is a specialty?
Yeah, I was going to say. That's quite the job.
Exposing serial killing as a specialty.
Yeah.
And he does it well. He does it very well. He explains it well. I saw him in a documentary by the film company I was working with last year on another film, and it was about the Unabomber, and he really explained it so well in just a sentence or two. He's used a lot in it. It's the Unabomber one where, I don't know if you saw it, I think it was on Netflix in the States, but where they have an audio interview with him in jail. Anyway, Vronsky is throughout that, and he's excellent in that. Just has these very good points to make, and usually in a sentence that you can understand in English.
Yeah.
There's a lot of serial killing experts, criminologists who don't speak in English.
Yeah, it's too far removed. People don't understand it. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're, to be fair, they're criminologists, and they're PhDs in specialties, and they try to narrow it down. But what Peter does is he tries to make it more accessible, so to say.
Yeah,
which is really important, I think.
Yeah, he's a good way to get across to people. Now, the other thing too, you're covering a lot of mafia. That's another thing. I think in general, people think that the mafia is done. It's sort of past. It's kind of over its heyday. That's not really true, is it?
Well, it's over its heyday, certainly. It's a totally different thing now in 2020 than it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, before Rudy Giuliani and all the rest went after all the people in the States, people here. But we still have a lot of mafias. It isn't one mafia. There's an Italian mafia. There's very big in Canada is what we call the 'Ndrangheta, what they call the 'Ndrangheta, which is the Calabrian mafia, which is extremely big in Italy. Italian police have been going after them the last 20 years. Is one of the largest mafias in Italy is the 'Ndrangheta. And of course, the Sicilian mafia is still around, but it's not nearly as powerful. The families in the United States not nearly as powerful. The one in Buffalo is just starting to restart itself. It's been very weak the last few years. The five families in New York have been pretty weak the last few years. Not like the 60s and 70s when Bonanno was around and Galenti, these legendary figures, or even John Gotti in the 80s. So the mob is still there, and in Italy, of course, they're involved right now in pandemic scams, if you can believe it. Naturally, the Sicilian and the Calabrian, and of course the Naples, the Camorra. So I would say there are more mob families now, not as powerful, not as singularly powerful as they were back in the past, but certainly all around, and certainly in the United States too, but not as noticeable.
What is it that they...
Sorry.
I was just going to say, what is it that they do now that's so different? Like, what kind of things are they focusing on?
Well, they do everything. I mean, they're very much in the fentanyl trade. One of the last convictions we had here of a major mob family, Ndrangheta, and involved with the five families in New York, involved with the Ndrangheta here in Ontario and in upstate New York, was involved in fentanyl. So they were doing fentanyl importation with Chinese, actually, with triads. They're not stupid, But then a lot of the mob families are still doing what they always did, gambling. We still have a lot of illegal gambling, particularly offshore gambling machines and things that the mob controls. Union stuff, not as much as they used to be, of course. Drugs, big time, other than fentanyl. They're still involved in the various heroin and methamphetamine, all that sort of stuff, marijuana, of course. So they're still involved in all the everyday things, but and of course murder and all the other things that come by of being a gangster. But they pretty much keep up to date with. We've had a lot of murders in Quebec and Ontario in the last few years, basically because there's been fighting among the various groups in the dominant mafia family, which was run by a guy named Rizzuto, and he died about 6 or 7 years ago. And there's been a lot of problems when he was in jail in the States for a while. If you remember Rizzuto, he went to jail for some killings of Bonanno family lieutenants many years earlier. Anyway, it created a lot of instability in the mobs here in Canada, and it's still existing. We still have people fighting it out to the death. We every 6 months or so we have another body of a Ndrangheta or a Rizzuto family associate found dead. So it goes on. I haven't been following it as closely in New York and the States as recently, but there have been the odd thing. But they're nowhere near as dominant as they once were. You're quite right there. Probably because of all the other groups, as we talked about. The mainland Chinese gangs, the Vietnamese gangs, the Russian gangs, the Russian mobs, the bikers all over the place, particularly Hell's Angels in Canada. We have a lot of different criminal groups. So it's not easy for the Italian mob to dominate as they used to.
Now, are these groups, a lot of them, into the human trafficking? Is that sort of a big thing for these gangs?
Yes, it always has been too. You go back to the mafia 150 years ago, they were doing human trafficking. You go back to Asian crime 150 years ago, they were doing human trafficking. In those days, they were bringing young girls into San Francisco by the crate to provide the men with women. and they went up to ship them up to Vancouver. That was 150 years ago. So the trafficking continues because it's something they can control, particularly with the Chinese government. For many years, a lot of people wanted to get out of China, and the snakeheads is what they're called within the Chinese criminal underworld. Snakeheads provided outlets. Usually they were very well connected with the mainland Chinese bureaucracy, the generals, the military, and they would get the people out from various places in Fujian province and Canton area, get them through Hong Kong, and take them on these very long routes through Europe and South America, Canada it used to be, and to a new life in New York City or Toronto or Vancouver, where they would start, working, not as legal residents, but they would start working, and the gangs had more people when they brought them over. So there's been a long, long history of human trafficking. And of course, the women were often used for some of the massage parlors, which we still have quite a few of in Toronto. I believe you have some in the United States too.
Oh, yeah. Jeez.
Yeah,
they appear quite innocent, but some of the girls in those places, in the Asian-run, Chinese-run massage parlors, are usually kind of indentured. We talk about slavery being such a horrible thing that it was in the 19th century, but we've had indentured slavery throughout the 20th century of peoples, and you see that within the Asian crime community. It's a way of paying, because it can be from $30,000 to $50,000 to get out of a little village in the Fujian province. So you've got to pay it back to the snakehead. So part of that, you work for a few years in a massage parlor. If you're a woman, if you're a guy, you do some jobs for them. Whether it's kidnapping people or running a pot establishment or running drugs across the border. A lot of speed goes both ways between the United States and Canada, even with the border and even with all the walls that Mr. Trump has put up down in Mexico.
Well, yeah, and none of the now the Hells Angels. What are their connection with the mobs nowadays, or what do they do for the mob, or how do they work with them? Like, what's the priorities?
Well, in Canada, the Hells Angels have, in the last 20 years, become supreme. They're the major biker gangs throughout the whole country, from British Columbia to the Maritimes, certainly in Ontario and Quebec. It was a biker war going back 20 years ago between several biker gangs, the Outlaws, the Rock Machine, but the Hells Angels became supreme. So they and their striker clubs are the ones that run everything. They work very closely with the mafia and street gangs in Montreal. There have been cases where the three of them get together, the Hells Angels leadership, the mafia leadership, which is weakened, as we said, not as dominant, still members of the Rizzuto family and their colleagues, and members of the street gangs, which in Montreal are Haitian primarily, get together and sort out various things. They carve things up, drug territory, a whole bunch of things. And there have been murders involving all three groups. Sometimes the mafia would use Hells Angels hitmen. Sometimes the mafia would use street gang Haitian hitmen. And funnily enough, the Hells Angels use their own people, pretty much. They don't usually go outside of their group for killing people. But the Hells Angels are pretty dominant in drugs in a lot of areas in Canada. Which, of course, means the United States, too, because the border doesn't mean a lot when you're dealing with organized crime. There's so many ways around the main border. So the Hells Angels are involved in everything from fentanyl to methamphetamine, all the drugs you can think of, trafficking in women, of course, gambling, just so many different activities, extortion, of course, still. There's just so many. And they're pretty powerful in Canada. Now, in the United States, it varies from state to state and area to area. I would say Quebec and Ontario are the two most powerful areas for the Hells Angels in Canada. And there haven't been too many good cases here in Ontario lately. The Toronto Hells Angels, they also involve legitimate business. They own bars. They're in pot businesses now. Pot is legal throughout all of Canada, so some of those businesses are run for and by the Hells Angels. And it's very hard to get at that. The police work on it. They still have special units and all that. So I'd say the Hells Angels, there are three really dominant international groups in North America, and I would say the Hells are the bikers, the Asian gangs, which includes the Big Circle Boys and the Vietnamese gangs and the Phucanese gangs, and some of the Russian mobs, I guess, but the bikers will be the third one. And there are other groups as well, but it's amazing. I started out working in organized crime, as I think I told you earlier in the interview, in a series for the CBC in 1974, early 74, and I never would have thought 45, 46 years ago that there would still be so much organized crime and that I would still be working in that area at all. It's gotten far worse than it was in the 70s and 80s, and in terms of overall organized crime activity. Quite amazes me now that I'm 74, and there are just so many organized crime groups in Toronto, in Montreal, and throughout the States, throughout the world. I'm sure you've read McMafia. I mean, all the Slavic and Russian groups that came out of the demise of the Soviet Union. It's incredible. Just incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So what do you plan on doing now? Like, where do you go from here? Are you going to continue doing these types of books and research?
Well, I'm not doing books at the moment. I might do one on the Macarthur case if this one that's supposed to be coming out doesn't come out. It's been delayed for some reason. But I think only because, not so much about the sensationalism at all, which is there, but a lot of that came out during sort of an aborted trial, but because of the police ineptness in dealing with a lot of this, and that I do want to expose. I've been working in a lot of different areas, documentaries, that sort of thing, helping out. I'm kind of, in a way, semi-retired because I'm working as a advisor, consultant, whatever you will, for these film companies mostly. Don't have much radio in my life, although I do have radio when it comes to ongoing crimes. I'm also a spokesman. Not a spokesman. I'm a commentator in Canadian media when various organized crime things come up, which a couple of weeks ago there was something, a shooting, a killing, an arrest, and so they put me on the CBC or the CTV news or the radio. But radio, yes, we have one wonderful radio station in Canada still. It's, we have several, but the CBC, in its wisdom, has a great show every morning called Metro Morning, and if you've ever heard of it. And they've been covering everything from crime to, organized crime to the serial killer very thoroughly. Because that's the one thing about radio, you have all this time. Metro Morning has several hours every morning just for Toronto. Metro being Toronto, right?
Yeah.
They have several hours to deal with what's happening in Toronto. So they have, whereas the TV news usually has a few minutes, and it's much more superficial.
Yeah.
So radio still has its place, and I do quite a bit of radio. I did some really recently. And these days, I don't even ask for money anymore as a consultant. So I was able to invest.
Do you have a website?
Sorry. Yeah, I do have a web page.
I was going to say,
tied in with the Crime Writers of Canada page. I used to be president and chairman of the Crime Writers of Canada, which is mostly a professional group of mystery writers, detective story writers, and true crime writers. It's been around for about 30 years, at least 35 years. And I used to be in charge of the awards committee. We just had our awards. Some fabulous writers are in there. So I have a web page.
I'm in there.
Are you in there? There you are. So you can look me right up there.
Yeah.
I'm going to actually do a web page this year with a friend of mine who's kind I'm a specialist in that, but I haven't done my own webpage. I just have been using the crime rate, so anyone can find me that way. A lot of people, who have been burned or hurt by organized crime, they have to find me, and they usually find me through the Crime Writers page. I call them walk-ins. You had walk-ins? Yeah. So, that's how I do it. And of course, I through a friend of mine, I worked doing these ebooks of 3 of my more popular books over the years. One called Mob Rule, and one called Mob Mistress, and the third one, Dragons of Crime, which we talked about. They're all available through the Amazon page and a few other digital websites. I'm not very proficient in all that, but they're very inexpensive, and it's something like $7 or $8. They're not very expensive to pick up that way.
We'll have all that up. We'll put that up on our website.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Can just find you real easy, and any mob looking for you, we'll help them out.
I don't think they'd have too much trouble finding me. We have one gangster that won't die here lately. His name is Pat Lusitano. They tried to kill him about 10 different ways in the last few years. He's been after me, but he barely escapes.
Wow.
Last time he got shot 4 times, and he got out without half the face gone.
That was exciting.
Yeah.
When you say back just before we go, you say police ineptness for the Macarthur case. Now, do you think that's because it's gay related? Is it that kind of an issue in Canada, or is that not an issue?
Well, it's part of the issue. It's very, like most things, it's very complicated. But part of it is they just don't know a lot about the gay world. 2, they didn't go to the right people. And 3, they got into, they did seriously want to try to solve the first few cases, 3 of them there were, but they got into tunnel vision. They got into some leads that turned out to be bad about a cannibalism ring. It's a long, complicated story, but they spent a year and a half on that. It didn't pan out. They arrested the guy for kiddie porn eventually. It was a faux cannibalism ring. There were real cannibalism rings in Europe, but this was not a real one. But as a result of that, they lost 4 years until from 2013 to 2017, while the serial killer was killing 4 or 5 people, they lost it. They weren't even investigating. And they didn't come back to it until, at that point, there were quite a few people missing, obvious people missing in 17, and they went back, and it only took them a few months to solve it then. But they had left it for 4 years, which allowed the killer to kill a lot. And that partly was that they just weren't familiar with the gay world. Like there were no gay officers on that squad. I know the chief investigator. He's not the least bit anti-gay, but he just didn't have good sources, and they weren't getting the right information either, unfortunately. And a lot of the people that were victims who were almost murdered didn't come forward. So it gets to be a very complicated story.
Okay, yeah. Well, maybe when you do that book, if you do it, and we'll have you back on.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Our guest again has been James Dubro. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.